Hi there, this is Koiro again with a different topic for a video. As I mentioned in earlier videos, I've been dabbling around with computers since the early 80s, and my first computer actually was a Spectrum ZX81 clone. It actually was a misbreed that was called the Marathon 32K, and it was sort of a hybrid. It had much of the functionality that was known from the Spectrum, but it also had some qualities from the ZX81 computer, so it was kind of this strange breed of computer. But that brings us on to today's topic, and a lot of computers was actually cloned back in the day. But I have to say, the list of Spectrum clones that has been available, and mainly in Eastern Europe and also in South America, this list is pretty comprehensive. And I will later get back to why I started to look into this. But first, I think we should have short talk about the different ZX Spectrum clones. We all know about, or some of you might know about, the American manufactured and branded computers from Timex Sinclair. This has also been featured in videos from, among others, the 8-bit guy. And this was legally made clones. They actually obtained a license to make these computers. And the list of official clones is pretty short, but the list of clones that was unauthorized, that's quite extensive. And most of these unofficial clones is made in Eastern Europe. You also have some here that was from South America, but most of this was made in Eastern Europe. And if we start to browse through this, we will not go into detail on any of these, but the original clones that was official, we just take a short brief through. And we have this Inves Spectrum that was sold in huge quantities in Spain. Amstrad actually went to legal actions to stop the sale of this, but they later went in and bought the component. And there also was the Decibels Spectrums for the Indian market. That was a legally made clone. And we can see that most of these clones that was legal had a huge compatibility factor, and they used most of the legal patents and intellectual property of the Sinclair machine, and also some variant of their ULR chip that did the screen drawing and other graphics functionality on the ZX Spectrum. And we can see there was a lot of engineering enterprises back in Eastern Europe that made more or less identical clones of the ZX Spectrum. But most of these is actually based on designs that's similar to the ZX Spectrum. Many of them used a cloned ROM chip of the ZX Spectrum, and this ROM was by no means licensed for the unofficial machines, and we have to take into account that some of them also had some modifications on the ROM chips to make this work with their slightly more or less identical copy of the hardware. And we can also see that a lot of these clones actually was manufactured quite late in the lifetime of 8-bit machines. This clone was made into the early 1990s, and they also had many variations of the ZX Spectrum where they actually had quite a lot of memory. So we can see here, this was a ZX Spectrum clone made in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1993. And it even uses a Russian ZX80 clone as CPU. And we have some more Russian clones. And this was also a 1993, 1994, 1998. And now we're talking really late for a clone of a ZX Spectrum. And this actually has 1 megabyte of RAM. And a lot of these machines was probably never made in any quantity. But as you can see, some of them was made in huge quantity. And the machine we are going to explore more in this video is actually this one, the Leningrad 1 clone of the ZX Spectrum. And they state here that it came to be the cheapest of the mass-made clones, and they tried to make the design as simple as possible and more compact. And this design actually has a reverse engineer functionality of the ULA chip, but implemented with standard 74 series TTL logic. And you can see there also was a lot more modern clones of the Spectrum, some of them probably made in just a very small quantity. But there are some exceptions. This was made in 1991 and actually has an IDE interface and a pretty high-res monitor resolution for a ZX Spectrum compatible machine. And this was made by the same developer as manufactured the Leningrad clone that we was looking into earlier. And this also was a very extended ZX Spectrum with much more memory. It had a built-in machine language monitor, and it had adapters for IDE and ISA slots, which actually allowed you into a ZX Spectrum compatible machine to use IBM PC compatible hard drives and extension card. And that was quite a feat to make on a clone of a ZX Spectrum. There also was some other clones. We are not going to go into detail of this, because when I look at the specifications of this, I think they varied quite a lot from the original design. But this is a bit interesting. In the Harlequin, ZX Spectrum is developed recently to aid the reverse engineering of the ZX Spectrum custom ULA chip. And this is the first attempt to make 100% timing compatible clone. And that is also the problem when you are using reverse engineer, where you use a black box principle to reverse engineer something. You can't actually manage to make this wholly compatible on the timing issues. And this was actually manufactured in a small quantity as a replacement PCB for an actual ZX Spectrum. And this is also featured otherwise with other channels on YouTube. And if we look into the external links here, there is quite some interesting trivia here for those who are interested. And I have browsed through some of this. There are some dead links in this list, but there are some quite interesting information here. And as I said earlier, we was especially going to look into the Leningrad version of a Spectrum clone. And this computer comes in several different versions. And this side lists some of the different homebrew versions of the Leningrad computers, and variants of the Leningrad computers often pop up on eBay, and I have actually seen them on sale on flea markets in Russia. But what we are going to look into is actually a variation of this board. And you might wonder why I go to all the trouble of explaining and going through the history of the ZX Spectrum clones. But the reason is that some time ago I actually got this one in the mail, and this is a version of the Leningrad clone. And this is a kit. This is a kit, I think it is available on eBay. It should be 100% complete kit. This is all the small components, and these are all the chips. And this is actually Russian. It comes from Russia. And if you see on some of these chips, these small ones, is, I think every one of them actually is Russian chips. And this is clone versions of TTL chips and memory chips. Every one of these chips is actually clones, and I have to look into, you saw on the schematics that I presented earlier and the PCB map, there it was stated ordinary 74 levels of logic and normal 4164 memory chips. So I actually have to interpret every one of these chips to see what goes where on this PCB. This is an original C-Log Z80, and this is the ROM chips. It's actually EE ROMs from Atmel, and it also contains a complete keyboard. This is the ZX Spectrum was never famous for its keyboard, and I don't think this will be much better than an original ZX keyboard. The keyboard is actually well laid out. It's a copy of the layout of the original, and you can see they have also included the writing of commands and stuff on the silk screen on this. But this keyboard is actually meant to be populated with these, and this is the same small tactical switches that you use on reset and other stuff on printed circuits boards, and they have no keycaps and no other stuff, so they're pretty horrible to write on. And the rest of the components, you can see here, it's Cyrillic signs, but it's quite obvious. This is the transistor array for the RGB, the crystal and the transistor, and they actually have labeled every one of the components: 2K, 5K, 10K, 1K, and everyone else of the resistors is actually labeled, and it's packed individually. It's quite high quality if you ask me. And you have, this is probably one N4148 diodes, and you have the coupling capacitors for the chips, and you have one more capacitor. It's 0.1 nanofarad and 100K resistors. So I think this is actually a quite nice laid out kit, and I think I'm quite happy that they didn't use TTL chips on this, because I think this will be more authentic. So this, I think, is actually quite nice. But this kit was supplied without sockets, and I'm going to populate this with sockets so that it will make for easier repairs, and if it doesn't boot at once, it's much easier to do some service on the board. And this board actually contains an experimental area down here that you can populate with your own circuitry. And there are versions of this where this is populated and this is taken out and they have put in some other functionality, because this closely resembles the original design. And they say that this was designed by Mick in 2017, and you have actually a web page for this guy, micklab.ru. Yes, and this is from the web page that was mentioned on the PCB. And I won't trick you into think that I can read Russian in any fluent way, but I actually know my way around the Cyrillic signs and I actually can interpret some of the Russian language. But in this case, it's really not necessary. If you press on ZX Spectrum here, you come to a list of different clones that he provides. And you have the Leningrad here and the Leningrad 2 here. And you also have some of the other clones listed. So this is a picture of his ready-built version. And this actually can be used for me to see where the chips are going to be placed. For as you can see, this is built with the Russian chips. So this concludes the first part of this series. It was rather longer than I was thinking, but it was meant to be an introduction into something that was a very huge thing in the Eastern Bloc countries. And the most prominent CPU in Eastern Europe was the Z80 CPU, where they actually made their own clone. And what you see here is probably one of those Z80 clones. Thanks for watching and hope to see you again soon in other videos. Please comment below, hit thumbs up if you like the video, and don't hesitate to subscribe if you want to see more videos made by me.